talk about the Middle East. I'm Andy Blanche.
And I'm Juliana Musheyev, and John Dickman is here helping us with the soundboard.
On this show, we talk about the Middle East. Its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region.
We hope to promote open and honest discussion about the conflict in Israel and Palestine and to humanize the conflict by getting to know people who have a stake in the issues. You're listening to WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton. The opinions and views expressed on Let's Talk About the Middle East are strictly those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station manager, the board of directors, or anyone else affiliated with WSLR.
If you would like to vote in the presidential preference primary on March 15th, you must be registered as a Democrat or a Republican. Florida is a closed primary state, which means only voters who are registered for the party which is holding the primary may vote. Therefore, if you are registered as a member of a third party, or if you aren't affiliated with any party, you will not be able to vote in the presidential preference primary on March 15th. The deadline for changing your party registration is February 16th. You can find more information at sarasotavotes.com.
Thanks, Andy. Today on Let's Talk About the Middle East, we're going to be interviewing Jimmy Johnson. He's a Detroit organizer, blogger for the Electronic Intifada, and former international coordinator for the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition in Jerusalem. His writing and photography have appeared in País, Haaretz, Maariv, and the Feminist Wire, Counterpunch, Truth Out, Mondoweiss, Against the Current, and elsewhere. That's a lot. Thank you so much for joining us, Jimmy.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself. How did you become an activist, and how did you get involved in writing and speaking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, when we're doing activism and organizing, one of the things that we talk about is doing outreach to the people, outreach, organizing our friends and coworkers and stuff. And basically, that's how I became an activist. Some of my friends organized me in the same way we try to change the minds and get other people involved. And that was when I was in the military, in the U.S. military. And this is in the mid-1990s, so around 1996. It was 1997, excuse me. And so since 1997, I've been doing organizing or activism of some form or another, whether that was in the United States or in Jerusalem. And as far as getting to work on stuff related to Palestine and Israel, mostly it had to do with just random life experiences that took me in that direction. I've got familial connections, but that wasn't what led me to organize around that first. It just happened to be that I was around people that was doing a lot of it. It kind of caught my interest. And so in addition to doing housing rights work in Chicago, where I was before I moved to Jerusalem, and anti-war work in Chicago, that I got involved in doing stuff around Palestine as well.
Right. I could totally relate to being organized by different people and just knowing people and falling into things. And
exactly.
And you're Jewish, right? So how does that affect your involvement?
I'm not sure that it does very much. I didn't grow up in a Zionist community, nor an anti-Zionist community. Actually, it was just simply very Americanized. Mm-hmm. If that makes any sense, And nor did I grow up significantly immersed in the American Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And so while I'm sure that there's something going on, I don't know that I can properly intellectualize it for you. There's some stuff that I did notice, like, I lived in Jerusalem for a very long time. And one of the things I remember one day, because I grew up in the United States, but one thing that I noticed, I was sitting in the office at the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition office, and I don't remember what I was doing. I was answering emails or reading an article or something, and I looked up at the computer, and it said December 25th. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, what is this? December, like, this is something. And I'm like, oh wait, this is Christmas. And so there's like a cultural milieu and discourse that was totally separate, and that felt very welcoming and familiar.
Yeah.
Where, to not be surrounded all the time by Christian discourse. And so there's that was, I guess you could say that's kind of an effect, kind of. But other than that, most of it has to do with when I do ritual and celebration, that it's kind of based in progressive interpretations of liturgy, as it were, like an anti-slavery Haggadah and everything.
So, the first time I saw you, you were talking about settler colonialism, and it was a really interesting talk. Can you explain to us what settler colonialism is?
Sure. Settler colonialism is an organization of power. And what I mean by that is it organizes social relations and power relations in the areas where it operates. As a more specific example, if today you migrated to wherever you pick, where do you want to migrate to?
I don't want to migrate anywhere.
Okay. Well, let's say you wanted to migrate to Brazil or France or Senegal or wherever it is that you'd like to go.
Right. Let's say Brazil.
Brazil. Okay. So you go to move to Brazil, and when you move there, you eventually, in some form or another, will become Brazilian. If you pass through whatever immigration regime and that there is. But one thing, even if in a small way, in whatever circle you're in, you actually change Brazil a little bit at the same time. But what you don't do when you move there is you don't displace Brazil upon your arrival and create a space of Americanness. So that's to say you articulate to the sovereignty that you encounter. You will in some way or another articulate to Brazilianness. Whereas settlers don't. Settlers do not articulate to the sovereignty that they encounter. So when the British landed in Senecomaca, which is what we'll call part of coastal Virginia, so when the British landed in Senecomaca, they did not articulate to Powhatan sovereignty. Instead, they brought their own sovereignty with them and created a British sovereignty which displaced the native sovereignty. And so, at a fundamental level, settler colonialism is about dispossession and sovereignty. And where the settler sovereignty, be it the United States or Canada or Israel or Australia or you pick, where the settler sovereignty displaces in total the native sovereignty that is encountered, and then creates a world in that image.
So, Jimmy, it sounds from what you just said that Israel fits, in your opinion, the description of a colonial settler state. Can you explain how exactly it does? With some examples.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. So much of the lineage of the Israeli political discourse, probably the vast majority, stems from what's called the Second Aliyah. And there are several aliyot. Aliyot is called like a wave of immigration or a wave of settlement. And so the Second Aliyah is in the first decade of the 20th century, by and large. And this is where the history of labor Zionism comes from. And there were three central ideological components to this. You had what are called the conquest of land, the conquest of labor, and this is the term. Conquest in the Hebrew is called kibush. So the conquest of land, the conquest of labor, and then the conquest of guarding. And what these three movements sought to do is to create spaces, kind of proto-sovereign spaces. And so the conquest of land is to create land that would be lived on by the settlers alone, by new Zionist arrivals from Europe. And the conquest of labor is to create spaces inside the labor market where employment would be reserved for settlers alone, or for Jews alone, as it were. Obviously, at the time, not all Jews in Palestine were settlers. There have been Jews in Palestine for a very long time, for as long as there have been Palestinians. So, and then the third one is the conquest of guarding, which is to take over the local relations of force in the areas where the settlers had conquest of land. And by relations of force, it means not being dependent upon Palestinians for guarding. And so where the settlers start to have their own sovereign violence, although it's still subordinated to the Ottomans at the time, and then still later subordinated to the British, where the settlers would start to have like their own sovereign violence, their own, which basically means they started to have sovereignty. And so that's how the settler sovereignty first came about in Palestine, and that's how Zionism, as a settler movement, started to become somewhat successful in displacing the native sovereignty, which is also displacing the native relations of force.
That's really interesting, Jimmy. When many of us think of the settlements, we think of the land issue, but the fact that there was a certain part of the economic sector set aside for Jewish Israelis, and the guarding aspect of it, I had never thought about before, and that's really eye-opening. In some of your earlier writings, you used the term settler normativity. Can you explain what that is and give some examples of how it manifests both in Israel and in the United States?
Sure. The settler normativity, when I talk with other men about sexism and patriarchy, one of the things that we talk about is how it's hard to see. It's very hard for men to see sexism unless it's an extraordinarily crude, bald example. I use bald as a negative, and I'm balding, so I don't know what that means. However, it's very difficult to see because sexism and patriarchy shape the very world that we exist in. And so it forms part of our frame of reference to the world. We understand the world through patriarchy. And from what frame of reference can we observe our frame of reference? And so it creates a difficulty there. Settler colonialism does the same thing. It is an organization of power. It does organize sociality in the same way that patriarchy or capitalism or racism do. And so it creates a normalized set of interactions and social relations through which we view the world. That is to say, it creates our normal. Settler colonialism is part of our understanding of what is and is not normal. And as an example, in the United States, you have a very popular football team out in the Bay Area called the San Francisco 49ers. And the 49ers themselves were genocide heirs. The conquest of California by settler colonialism was not carried out through a big military invasion by and large. In the same way that the Plains Indian Wars were and what have you. But it was mostly small individual acts or small group acts. And this was carried out during the gold rush. This is the native population of California was reduced by something close to 90% during the California gold rush. And this is through the actual actions of 49ers. It's not a consequence that happened because of them later. It was them who carried it out. But in our popular imagination, though, they were working class miners, they were dreamers, and what have you. The genocide part of that narrative is written out entirely. Thus, we can have a football team named after the actual movement that carried out a genocide with no thought to it at all. And so it has been erased because settler colonialism has made it normal.
This seems to me to be a really important concept for people who are working on this issue to understand, because the way you've described it, it explains to some extent why two groups can look at the same situation and interpret it completely differently. Which leads to some of the polarization in this discussion. So really, thank you for that important concept.
Right. Sorry, Jimmy, did you want to add anything?
No, please, continue.
So my question is, I'm Jewish as well, and when I talk to other Jews in my community about this issue, there seems to be, obviously a tone of fear, existential fear that I'm sure you're familiar with.
Sure.
And, the connection of the Holocaust with the formation of Israel and all of that. So my question is, do you think there's anything, because of the history of Jews, especially before the formation of Israel, that differentiates Israel from a typical European colonial settler state?
The specifics of any settler formation are always going to be unique and different. The United States and Australia, for example, share certain kinds of narratives, but they're dramatically different in any important detail, by and large. And it's the same with Israel. In my read, the primary kind of, I guess you could say, racialization that is involved here is between settler and native, and less so between Jew and Muslim, Jew and Arab, Israeli and Palestinian, but between settler and native. And when viewed through the lens of between settler and native, there's stuff that is very comparable and looks very analogous to what we see in other settler colonies. There are some historical or more unique aspects of it. Like, for example, Israel is one of only two settler colonies, or at least two that I know of anyways, that were not primarily sponsored by a state. I think it's only Israel and Liberia that were not sponsored by a state, but still created settler colonies. Settler rule fell in Liberia in 1980. And so that's very uncommon, and it's one of the things that people point to when they say, well, Israel can't be a colony because there was no colonizing country, which tries to shift the idea of colonization, not from the act of colonization, but to a space that is to a non-colonial space back in Europe. Which seems weird to me, but it's something that folks say a lot. But with regards to the existential fear and everything too, I have a little bit of a different take on it, I guess. And that, one, I agree with you, and I hear everything that you're saying. I'm very familiar with it. I think that's very real. But in my read, Zionism as a movement was never a preservation movement so much as it was a kind of group assimilation movement. With the Zionist critique of European antisemitism in the late 1880s into the 1890s and going into the early part of the 20th century is that Jews would never be able to assimilate in Europe. And I think that's true. I agree with that. I think that anti-Semitism is permanent in some form or another. At least in the European world as it is and was. And so I agree with this critique of assimilation, of anti-assimilation. But what Herzl especially was an ideologue around this. What Herzl sought to do is kind of to collectively assimilate as a strong, basically a Protestant nation that happens to be Jewish. A militarized nation where ideas of manhood were connected with settling and conquering land, somewhat similar to what homesteading is in the United States. And you see this in a lot of the language that's around there at the time, especially if you read Herzl's work and his ideas of who's the hero of Alt Neuland, like his famous book of Old New Land. So the hero is this Prussian military aristocrat, and it's only after the Prussian military aristocrat recognizes and validates the settlement in Palestine that it becomes a heroic story, that it becomes a success story. And so there's this whole idea inside of Zionism, which is the idea to assimilate into European anti-Semitism, but collectively as a group, rather than rejecting it like the Bundists and the Autonomists and other Jewish radical movements in Europe at the time did. They also rejected the idea of assimilation, but instead they thought, like in the Bundist example, they thought what in Yiddish is called Doigkeit, liberation Doigkeit, like a here-ness. And so we find freedom where we are, and that our emancipation has to do with the general Russian and Ukrainian and German emancipation. And so it was kind of more analogous to what the Black Panthers did later in the United States.
Interesting. So, Andy, I think... yeah. Sorry, I dropped the ball on one of these questions here. In one of your, so you're a prolific blogger. In one of your blogs, you frame U.S. support for Israel in the context of settler colonialism. Can you elaborate on how U.S. foreign policy towards Israel is informed by the fact that they are both settler colonies?
Sure. As part of what I mentioned earlier about organizing sociality and organizing discourse around settler colonialism, it seems to me that is reflected in foreign policy as well as inside the settler colony itself, as well as inside domestic policy. So you find lots of examples of writings by prominent political people in op-eds that point to this shared idea of being a nation of immigrants. Nations that the settler colonies, we virtually never call ourselves nations of settlers. We call ourselves nations of immigrants. And so there's lots of people that point to, to this narrative. And when, for example, when President Obama was in Darwin, Australia a few years back, he gave a speech where he talked about how Americans and Australians see so much in each other, the similar narratives, the settlers striving to cross difficult plains, some people arriving in bondage and some people like the convict labor in Australia, some people arriving in bondage and others arriving free and wealthy. And so in the very way that he tried to connect the U.S. and Australia, it was through the language and discourse of settler colonialism, and it's the same with Israel. So when political officials, write their op-eds about the shared values of the United States, the first one, almost as a rule, is that we're nations of immigrants and we see each other through this lens. Now, I don't think this is the only thing that has to do with U.S. support. In that particular article, I think the role that Israel plays in U.S. empire is much more important, probably. But it is one aspect of it, and it's one of the ways that we build support for each other. And as an example, a lot of times we say that U.S. policy towards Israel is guided by AIPAC or analogous organizations, whether it's Christians United for Israel, because, the Christian Zionists outnumber Jewish Zionists like 15-1 in the United States. So whether it's like Christians United for Israel or AIPAC or affiliated organizations, but I don't think that has sufficient explanatory power. One, because the United States supported Israel when it became convenient to do so, not when AIPAC was formed, but when AIPAC first became a big lobby, or AIPAC or its predecessors, because AIPAC wasn't around then, but when its predecessors. So the United States really started to support Israel in the 1960s, and it's not because there was some tremendous pro-Israel lobby at the time. You had people who enjoyed Israel and what have you, but they weren't the power group. Excuse me, I lost my train of thought for a second. And so, but its explanatory power is such that even in that, I think the only time that you find criticism of Israel in the United States is oftentimes met with a lot of hostility, and rarely is that hostility achieved in any type of other critique. The only other exceptions that I can think of is that feminists are subjected to a similar level of scorn, and anti-racists are subject to a similar level of scorn, and probably anti-capitalists as well, a certain kind of dismissal and rage. Like, what's wrong with you? What are you trying to do here? And I think because settler colonialism organizes our very social relations, that is one of the reasons why in the United States that criticism of Israel, because it's seen correctly as a vulnerable settler colony, that it is met with such hostility.
So, Jimmy, to follow up on that point you just made, do you think there's a point at which criticism of Israel can be called anti-Semitism?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it happens a lot, actually. Now, but by vulnerable, I meant more that it has to do with that Israel is vulnerable as a place where settler rule is more vulnerable than it is, for example, in the United States, where settler rule appears very strong. But yeah, sure. I mean, you run into people sometimes, and and they're progressive on only one thing, and it's just Palestine, and they're not progressive on anything else, and sometimes it's just life took them there. And okay, cool. That just happens to be their one little interest. And then other folks are there because they see or imagine in some way or another that by being opposed to Israeli policy, they can confront the Jews or something like that. That does happen. In my experience, it's not all that common, but it's certainly enough that you notice. Thankfully, in the communities of move-in, which are mostly progressives and anti-racists and Palestinian liberation circles, people tend to be generally committed to anti-racism, and they encounter that kind of stuff and either dismiss it out of hand because it's preposterous and awful, or try to engage it at that moment to say, like, hey, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way you're looking at the world. You can keep this viewpoint, but you're going to have to do this long ways away from us because we don't want anything to do with that. It doesn't serve anybody. You can't use an oppressive ideology as a tool of liberation.
So this is such a touchy issue, and sometimes it's hard to discern what's legitimate criticism of Israel and what's anti-Semitism. Do you have any advice for how to make that discrimination? Well,
let's see. Never really thought about it so much. But when... I'll try one other answer here first, and that when I mentioned earlier about Zionism being a movement of assimilating into European kind of nationhood as a collective group, that is one way of assimilating into anti-Semitism. I'm an anti-assimilationist myself. Even today in the United States, I do not like Jewish whiteness. I think assimilation is cooperating with a system that demands a need for assimilation, which is what we call anti-Semitism. I don't see anything wrong with Jews. I think we are fabulous and amazing, and I don't see anything wrong with it. Thus, I don't see the need to assimilate into whiteness. And so, for me, Zionism is a form of assimilation. And so, you see from time to time on some kind of blog, and someone talks about, if they're talking about AIPAC instead, they'll talk about something like Jewish power or something like that. And so we hear criticism like that, or not criticism, but I guess I don't even know how to call it, anti-Semitic critique, I guess. Or they only talk about AIPAC and they don't talk about the Christian Zionists, who are well organized and vastly numerous. And sometimes people say that just because it's bad analysis, but then there's some folks out there that are anti-Semitic. But I guess for any kind of recommendation, though, if we try to view our world through anti-racist principles, it's going to be hard for the anti-Semitic part, to work the way into our discourse and our circles in the first place.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I wish we had more time because there's a lot of things that you touched on that I'd love for you to elaborate on, but unfortunately, we only have half an hour. So, but thank you so much for joining us today, Jimmy. Is there any way for listeners to learn more about your work or get in touch with you if they want to learn more?
Sure. Yeah, anyone, always welcome to send me an email at johnson.jimmy@gmail.com, or you can follow my ramblings on my little blog at which is just CICO number 3, so CICO3 at CICO3.com.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can talk to you again sometime.
I look forward to it.
Awesome.
We've been talking with Jimmy Johnson, an activist and blogger from Detroit. If you're interested in exploring the situation in Israel and Palestine further, join us for an upcoming 4-part series at Fogartyville. It'll be held on the 3rd Sunday of the month, starting in February. We hope you can be there. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to learn more about this show, give us feedback, or share ideas for topics or speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Just search Let's Talk About the Middle East. Our theme music is from Merkava.